Name and shall we start?
हाँ हाँ ठीक है.
हाँ स्टार्ट करो.
So, a very warm welcome to the third day of our patient management workshop organized by Stratify, the official podcast of IMA MSN UP on the occasion of World Hepatitis Day. We have brought for you this 5-day event where we will discuss the various aspects of patient care and management with various eminent faculties. On the first day, we had with us Dr. Shiv Joshi sir, National Convener IMA JDN, who threw light on the bioethical aspects in clinics. Also, yesterday on the second day of the event, we had with us Dr. Ravi Kant Tiwari sir, Associate Professor, Department of Pharmacology, HIMSS Varanasi, who threw light on writing a prescription and prescribing the laboratory test. Before we proceed, I would like to thank Dr. Rajneesh Raj sir, State President IMA MSN UP, Dr. Rahul Anand sir, State General Secretary IMA MSN UP, and the entire organizing, moderating, and coordinating team of Stratify for making this event more wonderful and memorable. Moving on to today's event, now we will discuss in detail the microbiology and pathology sample collection and proceeding. Since lab tests are not difficult to perform, but it is also to patient to give. For more, it because they think more about repercussion if test come positive. Lab tests are not only a mirror of internal diseases, but also a support system for a doctor on which they can trust. In today's lecture, you will learn that in lab how samples are taken and how the tests are proceed. This knowledge will help you to choose between uh, to choose between the test to prescribe. And for this, please welcome our guest for today, Dr. Ravi Shankar Gupta sir. Dr. Ravi Shankar sir is MD in microbiology from BPKIHS Dharan. Sir is currently working as an associate professor in the Department of Microbiology in an MCTH. Sir is actively involved in teaching and training of medical students and inspiration to many. We welcome you from the bottom of our heart, sir, and thank you so much for joining us today. Also, I would like to welcome Dr. Savita Agarwal ma'am. Dr. Savita ma'am is MD in pathology and is currently working as an associate professor in UPU MSFI. Now, I would like to request Dr. Ravi Shankar Gupta sir to proceed the workshop.
Thank you, Hers, for your introduction, and good morning to everyone. And my name is Dr. Ravi Shankar Gupta, and thank you to Indian Medical Association, Medical Student Network of UP, that I have given the opportunity to speak about the sample collection and its proceeding for microbiology. Sample collection is also a very important part to all the medical student as well as to the treating physician and practitioner, as it plays a very vital role in diagnosis of the infectious diseases. So let's start our today's topic.
Yes.
So the aim of the sample collection should be that all the collected sample from the patient should be adequate and appropriate. Why it is adequate? If you not take the sample in the adequate amount, the diagnosis may hamper, and if you not take the sample from the appropriate site, then also you may mislead the diagnosis. So the collection, the first aim of the sample collection should be adequate and it should be appropriate. The second most point of the sample collection aim is that you should have sufficient documentation. Before prescribing any sample for lab investigation, the documentation should be full. It should not be half. It should not be written in a short form. That may lead to the lab person confused that what to test and what to give the result. So documentation while prescribing any sample for the lab investigation should be sufficient, should be full. The third aim of the successful lab investigation is that to diagnose any sample which comes to the lab, as we know that it is an infectious sample. So infectious sample should be always performed in a biosafety cabinet. If you perform the infectious sample in an open area or in a non-biosafety cabinet, you may infect the lab as well as to the health professional who is investigating or who is performing the test over that sample. And after performing the lab test, after successfully performing the lab test, you have to also decontaminate that sample in a proper way. Otherwise, that sample may infect the other person. The fourth point or the fourth aim of a successful lab investigation is that you should always have a correct packing and rapid transport of the sample. If the packing of the sample is not appropriate, the sample may leak out or the sample may get damaged or the sample may get contaminated. So you should have a proper packing of the sample and a rapid transport to the lab should be done. If a delay is there in sending the sample to the lab, the sample may deteriorate or the organism present in that sample may be killed or die. And the last but not the least, the successful laboratory investigation last aim is timely communication of the result. All the samples which are sent to the lab, all the clinician or a physician expect that the result should be immediate, which may help the patient in prompt treating or prompt curing the patient. So timely communication of the result should be done from the lab side. If the result is delayed or delay is seen in the lab results, which may infect the treating physician, the result should be timely so that it may help the treating physician in curing the patient. So these are some few aims of successful sample collection or successful laboratory investigation which we have to follow before taking any sample in the lab. Now there are some errors. There are some errors in the lab which are being divided into pre-analytic error, analytic error and post-analytic error. There are some error which may affect the result of the diagnosis to the patient. So pre-analytic error is the errors which are done before the processing of the sample. Before the processing of the sample, during the time of this sample collection, this pre-analytic error can occur. So pre-analytic error starts occurring when the physician or the treating surgeon or physician write any test to the patients. From there only this pre-analytic error can occur. Like for example, a physician has said a patient to go for a sputum AFB. AFB means you have a diagnosis for tuberculosis. A physician has said a patient to go for a sputum AFB. The patient has written AFB sputum test. Then the next step is patient preparedness. You have to inform the patient that you have to give the sputum sample for the investigation of the AFB. And the collection of the specimen is not done properly. Patient has not been advised that sputum should be collected in a container. Handling is not done properly. Sputum which is being carried by the patient is not handled properly in a leak-proof container. Transportation is not appropriate, and receiving of the sample in the lab. So these are the area where can mistake happen, which is known as pre-analytic error, and diagnosis may hamper to the patient. The next analytic error, the next error occurs at the time of the investigating that sample in the lab. So that outperformance of the test in the lab, how it is being performed, how the sputum AFB is done, how that sample is being stained, what is the staining procedure, who is staining that sample, whether that person is technically expert or not. So these are some errors which can occur during the time of investigating that sample in the lab, and that error is known as analytic error. Then next is the post-analytic factors. There are some factors which occurs after the test had been done and the report is being dispatched. Like for example, we have returned some test in a first sample, I have written that gram negative, doing a gram stain, and I wrote the result gram negative bacilli is seen. That report or result is being correctly interpreted by the treating physician or not, whether he has seen the report gram negative bacilli is written, so he has given the drug which affect the gram negative bacilli, or he has given something drugs uh, which is not being useful to the gram negative bacilli. So interpretation of the result, interpretation of the report, these are some factors which may create difficulty in treating the patient in the post-analytic factors. So they are the three factors overall: pre-analytic factors, analytic factors, and post-analytic factors, which may hamper the diagnosis of the sample to the patient. So before performing any laboratory test, before performing any laboratory investigation in the lab, you have some safety precautions. You have, that is already you people know, the PPE, post protective equipments, personal protective equipments, that is starting from the eye, goggles, gloves, lab coats, shoes. So these are all PPE should be worn. As we all know, working in a lab is itself hazardous. So you have to wear all the PPE sets, and then you have to perform any test in the lab. After performing this test, or during the time of performing this test, if you accidentally made any accident in the lab, first aid box should be ready in the lab, and after completing the diagnosis of that sample, you should have to decompose that sample in a proper way. So that is decomposing all the sample in the chemical or in any disinfectant solution. Now, the most important thing you have to note in a lab is that collection should be always accurate. Why? Especially in microbiology, why it is emphasized that collection should be accurate? Because if the collection is not accurate, or if the collection timing or everything is not done properly, then you may get a negative result in the culture. As I am a microbiologist, so in a microbiologist, culture is very important test in a lab. So if the sample collection is not done properly, then there is no growth in the culture. The desired organism may not grow, or if a grown sample is there, that may get contaminated. Contaminated sample will be grown in that media, and patient will not receive the correct therapy. He or she may receive the incorrect or a harmful therapy. So based on this, some guidelines are being prepared for the sample collection. Based on these things, some guidelines are being prepared for the sample collection. The first guidelines is about using harm or discomfort to the patient while you collect the sample. While collecting the sample, always you should care that while receiving the sample, I may not harm the patient, or I may not discomfort the patient. For example, if you take a pleural tap, or you go for a pericardial effusion, you have to do it in a proper way, or you do a CSF tapping, you should do in a proper way that may not discomfort or harm the patient. Second is, you have to always collect the sample in the appropriate site. For example, if I am suspecting for discharge, a gonococcal discharge from a female patient, I should go for a urethral swab culture, not for a vaginal swab collection, because this may lead to the this may lead to the not the proper organism to be grown, because the site is being changed. If you take a sample from vaginal discharge, you may not get the gonococcal sample. Third is, you should always obtain the specimen at a correct time. Timing is very important in the collection of this sample. For example, you can say like Wuchereria brandtkopfii, which is also known as a filariasis. This parasite, this larva mostly seen our body during the night time. It is said that you should collect the blood sample during the night time, because the larva of this Wuchereria brandtkopfii, it comes to the peripheral blood circulation during the night time. It can also be collected in the daytime, but the chances of these parasites or larvae coming in the peripheral circulation during the daytime is less. So timing of the sample collection is also very important. It is also said that if you go for any blood culture, or if you go for any sample collection from a patient, it is said that you should collect that patient sample when the temperature is in the peak rise, or when you have a high temperature of fever. That time it is said that bacteremia or septicemia is being circulating in your body, and That is the exact time when you collect the sample, you may get the desired organism in the culture. Fourth is you have to use appropriate device while collection of this sample. What sample is collected in what device, that you have to be very sensitive while deciding these things, because if you collect the sample in an appropriate device, that may lead to contamination of the sample, or that may lead to death of the organism in that collection device. The fifth thing is you should have to obtain the sample in a sufficient manner. As I have already said this, if the sample is not been collected in a sufficient manner or in a sufficient quantity, less quantity of the sample may also lead to the no growth of the organism in the culture, which may lead to a false positive diagnosis. And more important thing is always collect any microbial sample or bacterial sample. If you are suspecting any bacteria, if you are suspecting any bacterial infection from a patient, so always collect a bacterial sample or bacterial disease to a patient before starting the antimicrobial therapy. After starting the antimicrobial therapy, this also may lead to a misdiagnosis, because antimicrobial drugs does the killing of the bacteria, and if you are suspecting any bacterial infection, the bacteria, the desired amount of the bacteria will not grow in your culture. The last is correct labeling. After collection the sample, you should have to label it correctly. Incorrect labels of the sample may also lead to the wrong diagnosis. So an ideal requisition form should be based on these parameters. It should contain the name of the patient, it should contain the age, the sex, the IP number, inpatient number or outpatient OPD number, the timing of the collection, the date on which the sample is being collected. If the patient is admitted in the ward number should be written there. You should also write the type of the investigation, whether that investigation is urgent or whether it is a routine test. You should have to mention the nature of the specimen, what type of a specimen you are sending, whether you are sending sputum, whether you are sending saliva, whether you are sending urine, whether you are sending CSF, whether you are sending blood. So you have to mention the nature of the specimen and what investigation do you require from that sample. Like if you are sending a blood, do you require a blood culture? If you are sending pus, do you require pus gram stain? Or you are suspecting pus tuberculosis, then do you require pus AFB? So you have to also mention clearly what type of investigation do you require in that prescribed sample. And at last, you should also write the doctor or the staff contact number, so that the lab person can contact that doctors if any case of if any confusion is there regarding the sample collection, that he or she may inform to the treating physician or the staff nurse. Now, what are the samples that are normally collected in the microbiology lab? So normally collected samples are blood, urine, sputum, semen, CSF, blood fluids. Body fluids may, it is included pericardial fluid, peritoneal fluid, pleural effusions. These are the body fluids. CSF, gastric washing is there. Eye, ear, nose, pre-nasal, wound, throat, vaginal swabs are there. Nasopharyngeal aspirates are there. Fungal samples are there of hair, skin and nail, and some tissue, some biopsy materials are also there, which is mostly sent in microbiology lab. So these are the common samples which are sent in the microbiology lab for the testing. Now, what are the equipments which is required? The equipments which is required are, you required a swab stick. As you can see, even in the this coronavirus also, you require a VTM swab sticks are there, wooden sticks are there to collect the sample. You require a container, you require the gloves, and you require some medias where you have to collect the sample. These are the general required equipments which are required while collecting the samples. Now, what type of container mostly should be used? The container should be leak proof, because if any samples, whether you're collecting urine, whether you're collecting sputum, any container should be leak proof, so that any samples may not get contaminated. It should be unbreakable, and if you are sending any sample for culture, that container must be sterile, because in microbiology, any sample we require should be not be contaminated from the external environment. Otherwise, that may lead to the growth of that contamination in the culture media which we are using for the growth of the microorganism. Next is the specimen collection, appropriate device container. You should also require some transport media. Some transport media should be required while sending the sample to the lab. If there is delay in sending the sample to the lab, because I already said if the samples are not sent timely in the lab, that may contaminate the sample and leads to the death of the organism, and which will not lead to growth of the organism in the lab. And also you have to know whether the specimen collection, the investigation which you are required for sending in the microbiology culture lab, whether that organism, do you require an aerobic organism or that is anaerobic organism. That should also be mentioned in the requisition form. If it is aerobic organism, you have to collect the specimen in the aerobic jar. If it is anaerobic organism, you have to collect the specimen in the anaerobic jars. So transport media, different types of transport media are there in the microbiology lab. Mostly these transport media are safe and appropriate, and this is required to send the clinical specimen if you are finding difficulty to send your sample in the lab immediately. So what does this transport media do? This transport media will only allow the organism to survive. Just they will make this organism viable. Only organism will survive in this transport media. It does not lead the growth of the organism in that transport media. Only the organism survives in that transport media. No any growth of the organisms are drawn in the transport media. Organism only grows in the culture media, which we will inoculate in the microbiology lab. That is blood agar or Merkurky agar culture media, which will be inoculated in the microbiology lab. So some examples of transport media as Kerry-Blair media, which we mostly use for bacterial growth, and VTM. As you already know, in this coronaviruses, everybody is talking about VTM. VTM, that is viral transport media. So VTM is used for sending the viruses infecting the samples, which you can send these samples in the lab containing the VTM, that is known as viral transport media. And before sending the, after doing the collection, after containing the sample in the appropriate container, at the last thing is that you should label the sample if the sample is of high risk. If the sample is of high risk, you should label the sample with the high risk. For example, if you are suspecting any sputum with tuberculosis, you have to label it high risk. If you are suspecting any fecal sample suspecting of cholera, you should also label it high risk. If you are suspecting any throat swab sample suspecting of coronavirus, you should also label it a high risk. And serum sample which is being suspected of HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, infectious agent, you should label it a high risk specimen. All the specimen are not high risk, but there are some specimen which are of high risk. So you should label it a high risk specimen, because this is very much necessary in the lab. Now, there are some criteria of rejecting the samples. There are some criteria of rejecting the samples. If the samples that is sent to the lab is mismatched, the information is mismatched there. What is written, the request of the sample, and what is written in the label is not matching with each other, you may reject that sample. For example, if it is written in the container, sputum culture is done, it's written in the request box sputum culture, but you find that in the container only saliva is there is no sputum. So such type of sample you may reject it, as there is mismatch information in the label sample and in the request form. Next is if the sent sample is not sent in the appropriate transport media containing the appropriate temperature. If this transport media is not appropriate, temperature which is sent containing the temperature is not matched, if there is delay in the transport, if there is too delay in the transport, not containing in the transport media, such type of sample you have to reject, or it should be rejected, because that sample is been contaminated, or the organism which is present in that sample is been died or killed. And if the sample is not in the sufficient amount, if it is not in the sufficient amount, such type of sample should also be rejected. For example, in blood culture bottle, it is written that at least 3 to 5 ml of blood should be sent. If there is only 1 ml of blood is in the culture media, it's no use of doing the blood culture in case of adult. And the last is the leakage. If the sent sample contained in the container is leak is there, or any breakage is there in the sent sample, please discard it, because that sample also gets contaminated. Now there are some samples. Now we will discuss some samples, how it is being sent in the lab and what we do in the lab. So starting from the blood is very important. Blood mostly sent in the microbiology lab for culture. Mostly blood is drawn from the venous blood, and that is mostly drawn when there is high peak fever. So in case of infant, 0.5 to 2 ml of blood are drawn. In case of children, 2 to 5 ml of blood are drawn. And in case of adult, we do 5 to 10 ml of bloods. So these bloods are mostly collected in the bottle, blood culture bottle, that blood personal health worker, and it should be done by avoiding the contamination. From where the contamination can come to our body, when through the skin the contamination can reach to our body. If the injection through which the blood is being drawn, if it is not sterile, or if it is not a new injection, so blood collection should be done in an aseptic way, and it should minimize the contamination. After collecting this blood sample, it should be inoculated in a blood culture bottle. This blood culture bottle contains some reagents which helps this bacteremia to grow in that blood culture bottle. This blood culture bottle is then incubated in the incubator, and we see the growth of organism in this blood culture bottle and gives our diagnosis, or we find what type of organism is causing grown in this blood culture bottle, and then you go for the antibiotic test. So in blood collection should be done, transported in the blood culture BHI media, and then it is being incubated and inoculated in the culture media to get the desired organism grown. The next sample is the urine sample. Urine sample is also very important, especially in the UTI infection. When you are having a UTI infection, you get the urine sample collected. Mostly urine sample is collected, midstream urine are collected. Early morning urine samples are collected if you are suspecting tuberculosis, urinary bladder tuberculosis if you are suspecting, then early morning urine samples are collected. From babies, urine is also collected, but it is collected in a sterile plastic bag. But in case of adults, it is mostly collected in the container, urine container. This urine should be transported immediately after it collection, because we all know that urine is also a media where the organism grows. If there is delay in transport of this urine sample, you may find unnecessary organisms being contaminated, or unnecessary organism will grow in that container, which may lead to contamination grown of that specific organism in the media. So urine collection is very important. Second, urine collection should be done within an hour. If there is delay, suppose if there is delay in the collection of this urine sample, you can preserve this urine sample in 4 degrees centigrade, or you can put some adhesive like boric acid, so that unnecessary growth of the common cell organism which are present in the urethra will not grow in this urine, and which may not lead to misdiagnosis. In case of young infants, urine is a very difficult to collect the urine. So urine collection in case of infants or neonate is done by tapping above the pubis area, 2 fingers placed above the suprapubic region. After 1 hour of feed, and tapping should be done 1 tap per second for at least 1 minute. So 1 tap per second for at least 1 minute should be done, 2 fingers above the suprapubic region, after 1 hour of feed. That will lead to the spontaneous pass of the urine in case of neonates and infants, which will be collected in the sterile plastic bags. Now, after the collection of the urine, this urine will be inoculated with how this urine is being processed in the lab. This urine will be inoculated in the blood agar, McConkie agar, and in the clade media. Clade full form is cysteine lactose electrolyte deficient agar, with the help of the calibrated loop. A loop is there which is being calibrated with the 0.004 mm, and this calibrated loop will help to inoculate this urine sample in the blood agar, McConkey agar and clade media, and which will lead, then we will keep this in the incubator, and tomorrow we will see the growth of the organism, and we will see what are the organisms that are grown in the urine sample. Next sample collected in the lab is sputum. Sputum sample should also be collected by saying the patient to take a deep breath and cough up sputum directly in a wide bore container, which should be sterile, and it should have a capacity of 50 to 100 ml capacity. The collected amount of sputum should be 1 ml, and you should have to see that whether the patient have given the sputum but not the saliva or the post nasal discharge, that you have to see. The next sample is the pharyngeal wall, posterior pharyngeal wall sample, that is throat sample, throat swab sample. This throat swab sample is mostly done for pharyngitis. It is mostly done for sore throat infection. And nowadays we are doing this posterior pharyngeal swab for coronavirus. For coronavirus also, the sample which is being collected from our throat is posterior pharyngeal swab sample. A plain cotton swab is more for other diseases. We are using the plain cotton swab, but for coronavirus we are using the Dacron swab, which is being collected from the posterior pharyngeal wall, which is just seen when you open the mouth, which is will be just seen at the posterior side. A posterior pharyngeal wall will be seen. You have to collect the sample from there. But for other bacteria, samples can be collected from tonsils and from the inflamed areas in the mouth, where you can find the exudates. Exudates are some secretion which are seen in case of these diseases. The next sample is the nasopharyngeal swab. Nasopharyngeal swab, mostly you go for the diphtheria patient, mostly also in the coronavirus patient, H1N1 influenza viruses. We go for the nasopharyngeal swab, where a flexible fine shaft polyester swab is taken, which is being inserted into the nostril. The head is little bit tilted, and you have to leave that swab stick for at least few seconds there, and then withdraw it slowly by rotating the swab. You have to remove that swab stick. Next swab collection is from ear. Mostly ear swab collection is done in case of otitis media, external otita. In such type of disease condition, ear swab is being taken. So to take the ear swab, no drops should be used in the ear 3 hours before taking the ear swab, and you have to place the swab stick over the outer area, only in the external area of the ear, not in the middle area, because you may damage the tympanic membrane. And by gently rotating the swab stick, you can remove the swab from the ear. This swab, ear swabs, is mostly done for otitis externa, OSM, CSOM, any pus collection in the ear. So such type of infection, ear swabs are taken. So next is the eye swab. Eye swabs is taken mostly in case of bacterial conjunctivitis. When you are having a bacterial conjunctivitis, or you are having any gonococcal infection in the eye, so in such type of cases you have to go for eye swab. The eye swab is ideally pick up from the conjunctiva. You have to pick up from the conjunctiva. The conjunctiva are mostly from inverting the eyelid. You can see the conjunctivas are there, and from there you have to rotate the swab, and you have to take the sample from swab stick. Next is the pus swab. The pus swabs are taken from the wounds. See, remember, pus swab and pus collection, these both are different. There is a difference in the pus swab and pus collection. If you are having any wound infection, there the wound is dry, so there you have to take the pus swab. But suppose if you are having a wound infection when pus are being discharged, then that time you have to take the pus sample collection. So pus swab is mostly taken from the dry wound. The dry wound, the pus swab is taken very carefully, because this swab stick may get contaminated from the skin flora. It may get contaminated from the skin flora. The swab should be taken from the inner side of the wound, or the area where the pus is being accumulated, and you have to gently rotate the swab, and you have to take the sample. So pus swab is mostly taken from the wound where it is mostly dry, or a small amount of pus secretion is there. But if there is a huge amount of pus secretion from an wound, from that time you have to collect the pus sample. Stool samples are mostly collected in the stool container. And these stool samples are collected when you are having a diarrhea infection, diarrhea or dysentery infection from the Vibrio cholera or from the Salmonella typhi. So such time you have to take the stool sample collection. Rectal swab is also taken, but it is not good if you are having a stool. Rectal swab is only necessary where your patient cannot pass the stool or where in case of children. And this rectal swab should be taken when you have a heavily discharge or heavy feces can be seen in this rectum. From there you can take the rectal swab, but better you should avoid the rectal swab. Stool samples collected, once it is collected, you have to immediately send the stool sample to the lab. See, remember, always collect the stool sample from the patient, not from the bedpan. If the patient has done the stool in a bedpan, don't collect the patient stool from the bedpan, as that bedpan is being contaminated, which may interfere in your diagnosis. And transport this stool sample as soon as possible in the lab, because the organism which affect or which grow in this stool sample, mostly Vibrio cholera, it is a very delicate organism. It immediately dies in the external environment. So mostly stool samples are being transported in the transport media, so that this organism, which is known as Vibrio cholera, should be viable or should be present in the container for a longer period, so that you can reach to a diagnosis or this organism can grow there. Rectal swab. So I already said rectal swabs are mostly not taken, but if rectal swab has to be taken, it is taken from the small children or patient who cannot pass the stool. In such type of cases, these rectal swabs are taken, but it is good that you should take the stool samples, because you have some disadvantage of taking this rectal sample. You cannot microscopically diagnose the organism in that stool sample. If stool samples are there, at least we can see with our naked eyes what are the things that are present in that stool sample. Moreover, the rectal swab are not sufficient in amount to diagnose it, and mostly rectal swabs are not been recommended for viral infection. If you are having suspecting a viral infection, so rectal swabs are been non-recommended, because they all die in that rectal swab. So if you are suspecting any viral infection, so rectal swabs are not recommended there. Next is the pus. So I already said pus should be collected if you are having any wound infection which are containing a pus. Just you have to aspirate that pus with the help of the syringe and transport it immediately to the lab. Next is CSF. CSF is being done by the lumbar puncture in the sterile tube. Mostly in case of meningitis, we go for a CSF tapping. CSF is done from the lumbar L3, L4 in case of adult, and L4, L5 in case of children. This is done in a sterile container, because CSF is a sterile fluid. Sputum, stool, these are not sterile fluid. They are being passed from an area where normal flora are seen. But CSF is a sterile fluid, so it should be collect in a sterile container, and it should be transported to the laboratory immediately, because the organism which causes meningitis, again, it is a very delicate organism or delicate organism. It will die in the external environment immediately if it is not being transported to the lab immediately. Mostly meningitis causative agents are meningococcal. Meningococcal infections mostly die in the environment. But if you are finding delay in transporting this CSF to the lab, so better you should keep that CSF in the environment in the room temperature only, because if you put that sample in the fridge, in the freezing temperature, the organism, mostly that is Haemophilus influenza, it gets killed. So CSF sample, rest all the sample, if it is delay in the transport, you can keep that sample in the 4 degrees centigrade. But in case of CSF sample, you have to keep it in the room temperature if you find any delay in transporting that CSF sample. So these are some few samples, how they are being collected and transported to the lab, and its processing is done to diagnose the diseases. At last, I want to say that these all samples should be collected in a proper way, especially in microbiology lab. Sample collection is important, because we are here for the growth of the infectious organism. If collection is not in, collection will be not done properly, organism will not grow. If organism will not grow, we cannot prescribe any antibiotic sensitivity test. If antibiotic sensitivity test is not there, it will be very difficult for the treating physician to decide what type of antibiotic should be sent. So thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I hope audience got a clear note on their doubt. With this, we come to end of the first part of our workshop for today. We hope you all have heard carefully and learned well from Dr. Ravi Shankar, sir. I heard on behalf of IMA MSNUP would like to thank sir and request Dr. Savita ma'am to proceed with her topic for today's workshop.
Thank you, Harsh. Now, I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Savita Agarwal. She is a very knowledgeable associate professor in Department of Pathology, UPUMS, CEFI. We welcome you, ma'am.
Why the other person screen screen? Someone else screen. 1 second.
So my topic is pathology laboratory sample collection and proceedings. So I will be dealing with those samples which are collected in pathology laboratory or sent from the clinical site for further evaluation. So these samples include peripheral blood samples and tissue samples, cytology samples. We have fluids and many other samples. The procedure for collecting peripheral blood sample includes phlebotomy, and this must be performed by a trained technician under aseptic precautions. Now, the entire procedure should be explained to the patient whose sample is to be taken. And after collecting the sample, should be looked for the presence of any possible complication. And all the samples which are collected should be nicely labeled and before sending to the laboratory. Now, when many samples are to be collected, there is a recommended order of draw for peripheral blood in plastic vacutainers. So the first sample that must be collected is the sample for blood culture, followed by coagulation studies, and then comes the role of samples for biochemistry and serological studies. Thereafter, we collect sample in EDTA tube, which is meant for hematology purposes. And at the last, the sample for plasma glucose is to be collected, and the anticoagulant used is sodium chloride. All the samples must be accompanied by a wisely filled requisition form that bears basic patient details, along with the type of specimen that is sent, and also should contain date and time of the specimen when it was collected. And a specific test which is required must be clearly mentioned. There should be a note on relevant clinical findings and patient history, because all these findings help in achieving diagnosis. Now, for serological and biochemical testings, serum and plasma samples are needed, and it should be fresh and should not be hemolyzed or should not be lipemic samples. Now, before testing, if the test is not performed immediately, we can store the samples at room temperature, but for less than 8 hours only. If further delay is expected, then the samples should be kept in a refrigerator at 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. And if further storage is required, samples can be kept for months also, but then negative temperature are chosen like minus 20 degrees or minus 80 degrees. Now my entire session will be based on the background of hepatitis, in fact, viral hepatitis. So here is a list of tests that are usually recommended in a workup for patients with hepatitis. So the first test that is usually conducted is the biochemical test by the name of liver function test. And the sample in this category required is the blood sample, urine sample, or stool samples. Then hematological samples are also needed at times in hepatitis workup, where we look for the blood counts like WBC count, RBC count, platelet counts. We can also comment on that blood cell indices and that cell distribution with, and many other factors are also reported, along with general blood picture that gives us idea about the morphology of the WBCs or red blood cells. Okay, it also helps us in identifying the parasites if they are there. Then it is also very reliable test for estimation of platelet count. Another set of tests usually performed is in patients with hepatitis is coagulation studies. If results of coagulation studies are deranged, it is indicative of liver disease, especially the synthetic function of the liver is deranged. Then there is a etiology called as viral hepatitis. In that category, we need to do serological testing for various viral markers and can be confirmed using molecular testing, especially polymerase chain reaction. And there are two types of PCRs, that qualitative that comments on the presence or absence of the viral antigen, whereas quantitative PCR also gives us an idea about the viral load. Then other advanced techniques that are done in patients with viral hepatitis are virus oscillation and genotyping. Autoantibodies are estimated in serology samples and are relevant in patients suspected of autoimmune diseases, especially autoimmune hepatitis or primary biliary cirrhosis. Then histopathological examination is very essential and is frequently recommended in patients with chronic liver disease, and it is generally not performed in acute liver diseases. The process is invasive and thus it has its own associated complications. Now we will have a look at the causes of hepatitis, where the very important group is the infective etiology, where viruses, especially the hepatotrophic viruses, are very important cause of both acute and chronic hepatitis. Then there are bacterial, fungal, and parasitic infections as well. Then drugs and toxins are also very common in clinical scenario, where alcohol is the most common toxin. And amongst the drugs, we have paracetamol, halothane, isoniazid, and the list is pretty long. Then we have metabolic causes of hepatitis, where non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is a very, very common cause of chronic hepatitis amongst all ages. Then metabolic causes, another set is genetically inherited, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency or Wilson disease or hemochromatosis. So these are also included under the heading of metabolic causes. Then we have vascular causes, where there is Budd-Chiari syndrome, which actually means that there is thrombosis or obstruction to one of the hepatic veins. Then sinusoidal obstruction syndrome, another name for this entity is veno-occlusive disease, and it is frequently observed as a complication after transplantation and patients who are getting chemotherapy, where there is injury to the endothelial cells of the sinusoids. And then we have a list of immune causes like autoimmune hepatitis and so on. Now coming to the biochemical testing, especially liver function test. So liver function test is not just one test, it is a battery of tests or number of tests are performed. because liver performs numerous functions, and it is beyond the capacity of one single test to assess the entire function of the liver, and hence battery or panel of tests are performed. And these tests are usually based upon those substances which are either synthesized by the liver, or they are metabolized, or uh, those substances are normal constituent of the hepatocytes or biliary epithelium cells, and then they are released when injury occurs. Their level increases in the peripheral blood, which is then estimated. Liver function tests are used as a screening modality for liver dysfunction, and always remember that abnormal liver function tests do not always mean that there is a liver disease. For example, one of the parameters is estimation of total protein, which is indicator of synthetic ability. But the protein level is not only governed by the liver. There are many other factors, for example, presence of nephrotic syndrome, malnutrition, or protein losing enteropathy, all can lead to hyperproteinemia. So abnormal liver function tests do not always indicate liver disease, and normal liver function tests also do not always exclude the possibility of liver disease. Now, in liver function tests, many tests are performed which tend to assess various aspects of liver function. Like synthetic function, as I told just now, total protein is very important measure. Then we can also go through other tests like serum albumin, or measuring the ratio of albumin and globulin together, or coagulation factors profile is also very important, because most of the coagulation factors are synthesized in the liver. Then we have set of tests that estimates the metabolic function of the liver, like plasma glucose or lipid profile. Then serum bilirubin and expression is frequently used as a excretory function measure. And it is very important in differentiating between hemolytic and non-hemolytic causes of the jaundice. Then there are set of markers. In fact, these are enzymes which are present in the liver and are released after injury, like hepatocellular injury or after cholestasis. So after markers of hepatocyte injury are ALT, AST, RH amino transferases. So ALT is alanine transferases, whereas AST is aspartate transferases. And both these enzymes are elevated in hepatocellular injury, such as that which occurs after viral hepatitis or in after alcohol intake. So, but among these two, ALT is more specific for liver, but AST is less specific because there are many other tissues that produce AST. For example, heart. Heart is a very important source. So AST levels will be elevated in myocardial infarction also. So ALT is more specific for liver. And frequently ratio of AST and ALT is checked during assessment of chronic hepatitis. And if this ratio is more than 2, it is highly indicative of alcoholic liver disease. Then LDH is also a marker of hepatocellular injury. Now, another set of enzymes which indicate cholestasis are alkaline phosphatase, gamma GT, and 5-nucleotidases. Alkaline phosphatase is again very non-specific, and if measured alone, it is very impossible to say whether it is coming from the liver, or it is due to liver disease, or it is from bone. So it is always good to perform alkaline phosphatase along with gamma GT. If both are elevated, then this finding is very much suggestive of primary hepatic pathology. Then we have special tests where estimation of iron stores in the body can be done, like using serum ferritin. Then ceruloplasmin and copper plays very important role in diagnosis of Wilson disease, where the levels are deranged. Then we have alpha fetoprotein, which is a tumor marker, and its levels are elevated in hepatocellular carcinoma. And there are many other tumors also that produce alpha fetoprotein. Now just have a look at this biochemical findings in urine, and we will try to interpret them in different types of jaundice. So coming to hemolysis first. So in hemolysis, what happens in the serum, there is excessive RBC breakdown, which leads to elevated unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. And we know that this type of bilirubin is not soluble in water, and hence it is not excreted in urine. That is why the urine sample will test negative for bilirubin and bile salts, and giving normal color to the urine, and such urine is called as acholiuric urine. Okay, but conjugation is properly taking place, though larger amount of unconjugated bilirubin is being transferred to the liver for conjugation. So more amount of bilirubin will be excreted because there is no obstruction in the channels of biliary drainage. So because of large amount of urobilinogen and stercobilinogen, the color of the stool becomes darker. But in case of cholestatic obstruction, where there is obstruction to the biliary drainage, but there is no problem with the liver, so conjugation normally takes place. But only problem is that it is not being excreted. So their conjugated hyperbilirubinemia occurs because there is excessive accumulation of bile in the biliary channel, due to which pressure arises and it regurgitates into the blood and leads to conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. And we know this type is soluble with water and can be excreted in urine. And so conjugated bilirubin levels and bile salts will be present in urine, giving dark color to the urine. And this is also called as choluric urine. Because of obstruction, the level of bile will decrease. So in the intestine, so stercobilinogen and urobilinogen will not be present at all, hence giving pale color to the stool. Now coming to third category, hepatitis, this is a mixed type of hyperbilirubinemia. So both conjugated and unconjugated fractions are elevated. And because conjugated fraction is there, so bile, bilirubin and bile salts will be present in urine and give dark color. And depending upon the severity of obstruction which is there, the amount of urobilinogen and stercobilinogen will vary, and thus the pale color of stool will also vary. Now let's have a look at various hepatotrophic viruses. We know there are five types of hepatotrophic viruses. These are called as hepatotrophic viruses because they have special affinity for affecting liver tissue. So we have hepatitis A, B, C, D, and E. Of these, hepatitis A and E is transmitted by fecal-oral route, and it always causes acute hepatitis. Then hepatitis B, C, and D are transmitted through contact with body fluids, and it can cause both acute and chronic hepatitis along with carrier state. Of these hepatitis, only hepatitis B is DNA virus, whereas all others are RNA viruses. Now we will have a look at serological diagnosis of viral hepatitis, where the testing is performed through serological assays, which are based on the detection of either presence or absence of antigens and antibodies. Okay, and the sample used are serum and plasma. So these samples can again be stored at room temperature for up to 8 hours. Now the method used are rapid diagnostic test kit, and the picture is shown is here. And the advantage offered by this rapid diagnostic kit is that they are very simple, low cost. They offer diagnosis in very short time. They can be performed on capillary blood, whole blood, finger prick samples also, and they are single-use disposable assays. Whereas laboratory-based immunoassays are performed when large number of samples are to be tested, and the modality used is ELISA. They require sophisticated equipment, trained technicians, and also very good laboratory infrastructure. And those tests are expensive also. Now coming to serology of individual viruses like hepatitis A virus. So in this case, on serology, following markers will be tested. So it is hepatitis A virus RNA, which indicates active viral replication, which is looked for in either blood or fecal samples. And then antibody that is produced against HAV is anti-HAV antibody, and it is of two types, IgM and IgG. This is a very basic concept that IgG and IgM is initial response antibody. So it is seen in acute phases, whereas in the chronic phases or recovery part, this IgM is completely replaced by the IgG type of antibodies. Now we will have a look at the serological profiling hepatitis A. Now coming to acute hepatitis A virus due to hepatitis A virus, because it is acute infection, so an immunoglobulin which will be present is anti-HAV IgM, and because it is hepatitis infection is there, so HAV RNA will be present. Now, another situation is past infection, which is required after infection that has recovered. So, because it has progressed from the acute phase, so only IgG anti-HA will be present. And because there is no active infection, so no HAV RNA will be detected. And same situation is with vaccination, when only anti-HAV IgG is noted on serology. Now coming to hepatitis B virus, and it is known to cause both acute and chronic hepatitis, and patients may remain asymptomatic or may have symptomatic disease. Now before coming to the serology of hepatitis B virus, let's have a look at the set of antigens on the HBV viruses that the HBV viruses expresses. So we have basically three types of HBV antigen, of which the first one is surface antigen. It is called as hepatitis B surface antigen, and this particular antigen is present on the surface envelope of the virus, and this is also the first antigen to appear on serological testing. Now always remember that the positive reaction for hepatitis B surface antigen always indicates infection. So if HBsAg is present, that means infection is present. And this can also occur soon after vaccine when HBs antigen is administered. Now during vaccination, the HBs antigen which is given is not infective and it is recombinant type. The second antibody that we will learn is E antigen. So this is called as hepatitis B E antigen. It remains between the envelope and nucleocapsid. And this importance of this antibody is lie in the fact that it is a marker of active viral replication. That means if hepatitis B E antigen is present, it means that active disease is going on, active viral replication is taking, and thus there is increased infectivity. Now, another third type of antigen is the core antigen, which is called as hepatitis B core antigen. Now, the points to remember in this regard are that this particular antigen is never released in the circulation. It remains trapped within the nucleus of the hepatocyte. So on serological testing, we cannot detect hepatitis B core antigen, but yes, by using immunohistochemistry, we can detect the presence of this antigen in the nuclei of hepatitis. We will be seeing picture of this in the later slides. Then coming to the antibodies, these antibodies are produced by the host in response to HBV infection. So the first antibody that is produced is against hepatitis B core antigen, that is hepatitis B core antibody. So remember that this is the first type of antibody that appears. Now, it is of two types, IgM and IgG. As I have already told that IgM type of antibody indicates acute infection. So when it is acute hepatitis by hepatitis B virus, there will be presence of IgM hepatitis B core antibody. But when it is chronic hepatitis B infection, it will show IgG hepatitis B core antibody. Now, the second antibody to appear is E antibody, that is hepatitis B E antibody, which is secreted only after hepatitis B E antigen disappears. So, it is secreted in response to hepatitis B E antigen and is identified only after disappearance of hepatitis B E antigen. So, we have learned that hepatitis B E antigen indicates active viral replication and increased infectivity. Thus, presence of hepatitis B E antibody indicates that active replication is not taking place, infectivity has reduced, and active disease has resolved. So, the patient has been through the active phase of the hepatitis. Now, the last antibody is the surface antibody. This is the most important antibody because this antibody is responsible for clearing the virus and curing the infection. And it is produced after hepatitis B surface antigen disappears. So presence of hepatitis B surface antigen antibody indicates that the person is cured. And second response is that it will be seen after vaccination when recombinant hepatitis B surface antigen is given, and the purpose is to stimulate production of hepatitis B surface antibodies which are protective. Now we will have a look at the serological profile in case of hepatitis B virus infection. We will be covering both acute and chronic. So the markers we have already seen, we have hepatitis B surface antigen and hepatitis B E antigen. Hepatitis B core antigen is never detected in serology, so we will not talk about it. And the corresponding antibodies will be anti-hepatitis B surface antigen, anti-hepatitis B E antibodies, and anti-hepatitis B E. Now, taking different scenarios, when individual is never infected, none of the antigen or antibodies will be detected. Now, coming to the incubation period and prodrome acute disease, that means very early phase of the infection or acute disease. The picture is similar. Because infection is there, so obviously hepatitis B surface antigen will be positive. And because this is positive, anti-hepatitis B surface antibodies will be negative. Another point is that it is acute phase of the disease, both incubation period and early stage of acute disease. So only IgM antibody against anti-hepatitis B core will be present. And because active viral replication is taking place in both, hepatitis B E antigen will be present and corresponding antibody will be negative. Now, another point which is very important to remember is window period. This is the period when hepatitis B surface antigen has disappeared, but anti-hepatitis B surface antibody has not yet appeared. So, if on serology tests are used based on this antigen and antibody, we will get negative result. So the only marker that helps in establishing the diagnosis of hepatitis B virus infection during window period is presence of IgM anti-hepatitis B core antibodies. Now, convalescent or recovery, that indicates the later part of the infection. So it is recovery, that means there is no infection, so no hepatitis B surface antigen. And because this surface antigen has disappeared, surface antibody will be positive. Now it is later part, it is not acute disease, so all the IgM is not replaced by IgG by this time. So we will get IgG anti-hepatitis B core antibodies. And because this is convalescent recovery, no infection, no viral replication, so no hepatitis B E antigen, but yes, the corresponding antibody will be there. Now, coming to chronic hepatitis, we have two forms, the active form and non-active form. By saying active form, I mean that active viral replication is taking place. And when I say non-active chronic hepatitis B, it means that active viral replication is not taking place. But because it is chronic hepatitis, infection is there. So in both these scenarios, hepatitis B surface antigen will be present, corresponding antibody will be absent. Now, because it is chronic, so no IgM, but IgG anti-hepatitis B core antibodies will be there. Now, because chronic active hepatitis B, we have active viral replication. So hepatitis B antigen will be present, but corresponding antibodies will be absent. In contrast, in non-active chronic hepatitis B, because viral replication is not taking place, so no hepatitis B E antigen will be detected, but corresponding antibody will be present. Now, coming to another scenario when vaccination is given, exposure to only hepatitis B surface antigen occurs. So antibody response to this antibody is only present, and rest all antibodies will not be present in case of vaccination. But when immunity occurs after natural infection, because there is exposure with all the antigens, so antibody response to all the three antigens will be there. That is, will show anti-hepatitis B surface antibodies, IgG, anti-hepatitis B core antibodies, and also anti-hepatitis B E antibodies. Now, coming to hepatitis C virus, it mainly causes chronic liver disease, and the markers that can be detected on serology are hepatitis C virus core antigen, and hepatitis C virus RNA, and anti-HCV antibodies. Now we will look at the serological results. So in case of acute hepatitis, because infection is there, viral replication is there, so HCV RNA will be positive. And because it is acute, so antibody may come out to be negative. Anti-HCV antibody may come out to be negative because it takes little time to appear, almost say 6 to 20 4 weeks it may take to appear. So anti-hepatitis C viral antibody may come out to be negative. Then another scenario is when there is infection and there is spontaneous resolution. So resolution has taken place, that means no infection is there, and hence HCV RNA will be absent. But immunity has developed, so immune response has taken place, so anti-HCV antibody will be present. Then in case of chronic infection, because infection is there, so HCV RNA will be there. At the same time, anti-HCV antibodies will be there. So in case of chronic infection, both antigen, that is HCV RNA, and anti-HCV antibodies, both will be detected. Now coming to hepatitis D virus, this is also called as Delta virus, and it is a defective virus in the sense that it requires hepatitis B virus for its replication. Thus, infection can occur in two scenarios, like as co-infection, where there is simultaneous infection with hepatitis B virus and hepatitis D virus, and in this picture, always acute hepatitis develops. But second scenario is that of superinfection, which occurs on top of chronic hepatitis. So when this happens, like superinfection of hepatitis D virus on chronic hepatitis, it may cause acute disease or it may cause chronic hepatitis. So we will have look at serological profile of HDV infection. So in case of co-infection, as I told just now, it is acute hepatitis for both HBV and HDV. So the markers of acute HBV is an IgM anti-HB core, which will be positive, and along with hepatitis B surface antigen. Then the markers of HDV infections, like its antigen, that is hepatitis D virus antigen, and HDV RNA, both will be positive. And because it is acute, so there will be IgM anti-HDV, which may remain transiently positive, and later it will be replaced by IgG anti-HDV antibodies. Now, second scenario where superinfection occurs. So when in case of superinfection, acute hepatitis D virus hepatitis occurs, the picture is more or less similar with that of acute hepatitis B virus, where antigen and RNA both will be positive for HDV, and because of acute infection, IgM will be there against HDV, and later replaced by IgG antibody. But because it is on top of chronic hepatitis, so IgM anti-hepatitis B core anti will not be positive, but in fact IgG anti-hepatitis B core antibodies along with hepatitis B surface antigen will be detected. Now, in another scenario where chronic hepatitis develops in patients with who are infected with HDV on with the chronic hepatitis B virus infection. So, because it is chronic infection is there. So, HD antigen and HDV RNA both will come out to be positive, but because it is chronic, so only IgG anti-HDV will be positive, IgM anti-HDV will be negative. Now coming to hematological testing, so as I have already conveyed that various tests can be performed in patients with hepatitis, like assessment of total blood count, WBC count, cell count, platelet count, and others to look for presence of leukopenia or cytopenia. Then general blood picture to look for presence of atypical lymphocytes in case of acute viral hepatitis. SCV is known for causing pancytopenia and also autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And similar complications are seen after giving treatment, antiviral treatment for SCV, like in the form of interferon alpha and ribavirin. Then coagulation studies are particularly important, and they assess basically extrinsic and intrinsic pathway coagulation factors which are synthesized by the liver. So if there is liver insufficiency, the decreased synthetic ability, PT and APTT will come out to be prolonged. Now coming to histopathology, so histopathology, as I have already told, it is regarded as gold standard modality in management of patients with chronic liver disease. But there are certain indications when liver biopsy is performed. So it is performed recommended when there is unexplained derangement of liver function test, or in patients who are presenting with cholestatic liver disease but cause is not known. Similarly, portal hypertension, cause is not known. Liver biopsy is indicated. It is routinely done in chronic liver diseases, not only for establishing the diagnosis but also for grading and staging purposes. In grading, the assessment of severity of necrosis and inflammation is done. Whereas in staging, in case of chronic liver disease, it is done to look for the severity of fibrosis. Similar, and it can also help in assessing the response to the treatment in case of chronic liver diseases. Liver biopsy is also indicated in patients with fever of unknown origin and various systemic diseases such as leukemias or lymphoma, and it is primarily for staging purposes. Then liver biopsy can be performed in patients where drug-induced liver injury is suspected for typing of hepatic neoplasm, both primary and secondary. And here it also offers application of immunohistochemistry as an ancillary testing, which enables classification of the tumors. And it is also indicated in management of patients who have undergone liver transplantation, because to look for the evidence of transplant rejection, and also to look for the changes due to immunosuppressive therapy that these patients get. Now coming to the types of biopsy, so we have 4 types of liver biopsies, of which percutaneous liver biopsy is the most commonly type of biopsy performed in diffuse liver disease, and it can be done under radiologic guidance or without radiologic guidance. And for case of focal lesions, radiologic guidance is must. For example, hepatocellular adenoma, carcinoma, or metastatic disease, if the disease process is focal, it has to be performed under radiologic guidance. Then the type of needles, both suction and cutting needles are used for obtaining liver tissue. Then another very important type of biopsy is transvenous liver biopsy, which is also called as transjugular liver biopsy. And the indication of this type of biopsy is like when the patient has chronic liver disease with coagulation disorder, which is either due to liver disease itself or due to any other cause. So in these patients, transvenous or transjugular liver biopsy is performed. Because percutaneous liver biopsy, if done in these patients, carries significant risk of bleeding. But this transjugular liver biopsy is to be performed by radiologists only under radiologic guidance, and it requires complex setup and significant experience, because it is in this biopsy, tissue is obtained after passing a needle through vascular system of the liver. Then we have laparoscopic liver biopsy. This is like done when diagnostic laparoscopy is performed, and both any method can be used or any needle can be used for taking the biopsy, and it also offers the advantage of direct visualization of liver during the procedure. Then another type of biopsy is wedge liver biopsy. This type of biopsy is done under intraoperative settings or when diagnostic laparotomy is performed. But this is not very preferred type of biopsy, because it tends to sample the tissue from the periphery of the liver. And at the periphery, we have Gleason capsule and subcapsular region which gets sampled. And these sites contain significant amount of fibrous tissue. Hence, the biopsy tissue which is obtained usually yields are inadequate for opinion, because we hardly get any parenchymal tissue for interpretation. Hence, it is not preferred type of biopsy. Then having a look at the picture of type of biopsy, so this triangular tissue is obtained in case of wedge biopsy, core needle biopsies, look like this. Then we have transvenous or transjugular liver biopsy are generally fragmented because the cores that are obtained during a transvenous biopsy are very thin. They are very fragile, so they get fragmented. So these are the pictures. As soon as the biopsy is obtained, it is immediately placed in a fixative, and the commonly universal fixative is 10% neutral buffer formalin, and it has to remain in this formalin for adequate fixation for at least 2 to 4 hours. After that, the biopsy tissue is wrapped in a lens paper, and it is then submitted in custard for further processing. Now coming to the microscopic examination of liver biopsy, so the routinely used stain is hematoxylin and eosin. Along with this stain, we need to have certain special stains like reticulin stain that evaluate the reticulin meshwork framework of the liver, and it is particularly important in those situations where ventricular mesh get damaged, as in the case of collapse or massive hepatocyte necrosis. It also gives us an idea of thickness of the hepatocyte cord, which is significantly increased in case of hepatocellular carcinoma. So these are few indication of reticulin stain. Then Mason's trichome is one of the connective tissue stain, and it is performed to look for the severity of the fibrosis, and it has to be done routinely. Pulse stain is used for assessment of iron stores, which is there in the form of ferritin. Then Orson stain is the stain for assessment of copper associated proteins. Then another stain is periodic acid shift with diastase, and it has its importance in management of storage disorders. And then before going to the microscopic examination of the tissue obtained, it is mandatory to assess the sample for its adequacy. And the core, which is about 1.5 to 2 centimeter in length and has 11 to 14 portal tracts, are considered as adequate, and less than this is regarded as inadequate. And inadequate samplings are not preferred because they tend to underestimate the necroinflammatory activity, which is called as grading, and degree of fibrosis, which is called as staging in case of chronic liver disease. Now, before coming to microscopic features of acute and chronic viral hepatitis, we'll have a look at the microscopic picture of normal liver biopsy. So here we can see a lobule. In the center, we have terminal hepatic venule, and at the periphery, we have portal tract. In between, we have cords of hepatocytes. You see, these are all single cell thick, and this is a normal in adults. Okay, and then we have areas, intervening areas which are sinusoid. So blood flows from the portal area and enters the sinusoid, and then leaves the liver through central vein and the distributed vein. Then we have like if you observe in this picture, all these structures, the central vein, the portal tract, they are all evenly distributed, and this is what is called as normal hepatic architecture or lobular architecture. So suppose if an area of hepatocyte is lost from here, or there is fibrosis in this area, what will happen? The two structures will come closer. There will be approximation of central vein and portal tract, or two portal tract, leading to distortion of the hepatic lobular architecture. Now this is a closer view of a portal tract, where we can see a portal venule, a bile duct which is lined by cuboidal epithelium, and then we have a hepatic artery. And what I want to show in this picture is a rim of hepatocyte which is closely abutting the mesenchyme of the portal tract, and this rim, this continuous rim, is referred to as limiting plate. And the significance of this limiting plate hepatocyte is in the interface hepatitis, which is characterized by spilling of inflammatory cells from the portal tract into the adjacent liver parenchyma, damaging the limiting plate hepatocytes, which indicates presence of interface hepatitis, which is an indicator of progressive liver disease. Now, the morphology changes in case of acute and chronic viral hepatitis are similar in all types of hepatotrophic viruses, and few histologic changes may be indicative of a particular type of virus that we will see through photographs. Then we will come to the microscopic features of acute viral hepatitis. Always remember that acute viral hepatitis primarily shows changes in the hepatic parenchymal lobules, whereas in case of acute chronic viral hepatitis, changes are mainly in portal and periportal areas. Okay, in acute viral hepatitis, changes are mainly in hepatic parenchymal lobules. So what are the changes? We will get to see distortion of the lobular architecture, and because it is inflammation, hepatitis is there, so there will be inflammation mainly in the lobule. And because it is viral infection, even though it is acute, the response will be of chronic mononucleotide. So the cells that we get to see in the lobule are leukocytes, macrophages, plasma cells with very few neutrophils. Total changes are there, but they are not so conspicuous, and they show variable amount of mononuclear inflammation. Then because of inflammation, there is hepatocellular injury, which is seen in the form of degeneration. One form is pulmonary degeneration, which is characterized by swelling of the hepatocytes. And it is kind of hydropic degeneration. And when the cell swells beyond its limit, what will happen? The cell will rupture, leading to lytic necrosis, where there is single cell necrosis. Okay. So cell death occurs by apoptosis and also by necrosis. We know what lytic necrosis is, single cell necrosis, and of course after voluminary degeneration is when it is severe. Then focal or spotty necrosis refers to necrosis of very small groups of hepatocytes. Then we have, confluent necrosis, where larger groups of the hepatocytes are lost. Then bridging necrosis refers to entire band of hepatocytes which get necrosed, and this band connects two structures like maybe two portal tracts or two central vein, or maybe one is portal tract and one is central vein. So portocentral bridging necrosis or veno-venous bridging necrosis can occur. Similarly, even more extensive form of necrosis in liver are termed as submassive necrosis and massive necrosis. Then because hepatocyte cell death is taking place, so liver starts to regenerate, because liver has a significant capacity to regenerate in order to compensate for the hepatocyte loss, regeneration occurs. And evidence of regeneration are seen in the form of mitotic activity and presence of binucleated hepatocyte and even thickening of the single cord of hepatocyte, which was initially single cell thick. Now it becomes one or two or three cell thicks. Then we have cholestasis, which may or may not be there in case of acute viral hepatitis. Then portal fibrosis and neoangiogenesis are never a feature of acute viral hepatitis, because portal fibrosis and neoangiogenesis are seen in chronic hepatitis only. Now we will have a look at a few photographs of acute hepatitis to see various features that we discussed just now. So this picture basically shows the disruption of the lobular architecture, because there is infiltration that is mainly lymphocyte, and it is not very extensive in this case. It is primarily located in the sinusoid. So it is intrasinusoidal lymphocytic infiltration. And then if you notice, this is a central vein where we have these red blood cells. Okay. Within the central vein, we have a ring of hepatocytes which is already damaged. So this is confluent necrosis, where large groups of contiguous hepatocytes are damaged, are lost, are necrosed. Okay, so, and because it is in perivenular region, that is why it is called as perivenular confluent necrosis. Then another conspicuous finding is the presence of balloon hepatocyte that you can see in this picture. In this focus, the higher magnification is here, where it is obvious that the cell is significantly swollen and the cytoplasm is rarefied. It is pale in appearance. Otherwise, the cytoplasm of hepatocyte is pink in color, but here it has become pale and it is rarefied with only few strands of cytoplasm that is accumulated around the perinuclear region. Similarly, in this case, accumulation of cytoplasmic remnants in the perinuclear region, and thus these are ballooned hepatocytes. Now coming to another feature of acute hepatitis, these are apoptotic bodies. In case of acute viral hepatitis, they are called as acidophilic bodies. It is a type of cell death, apoptosis, and this acidophilic body, the name as is given because these cells have densely stained eosinophilic cytoplasm. Eosinophilic means dense pink cytoplasm, and the nucleus is small and pycnotic and darkly stained. So this is how an apoptotic cell appears, and it is a type of cell death. And in case of acute viral hepatitis, it is called as acidophilic body. This is another purpose of acidophilic body, but now in this case, it is surrounded by few inflammatory cells, which are actually scavenger cells. They are attempting to remove it from the site. Then spotty necrosis is more severe form of necrosis, where small groups of hepatocyte necrosis have taken place, and these necrosed hepatocytes are now surrounded by lymphocytes and other scavenger cells like macrophages. Now compare this type of necrosis, that is spotty necrosis, with the confluent necrosis, which is more extensive necrosis involving large groups of of hepatocytes. Here it was small groups of hepatocytes, here it is large groups of hepatocytes, contiguous hepatocyte necrosis. So this is more severe. Now this is bridging necrosis, and in bridging necrosis, as I have already told, the entire band of hepatocytes between two structures, like in this case it is central vein here and it is portal tract here. The entire band of hepatocytes are necrosed and they are now replaced by inflammatory cells and cellular debris. This is called as bridging necrosis. In this case it is portocentral bridging necrosis. This is portocentral bridging necrosis. Now, even more extensive form of necrosis is panlobular necrosis. It is also called as pan-acinar necrosis because entire hepatic lobule is necrosed. Okay, it is also called as submassive necrosis, and the criteria cutoff for submassive necrosis is that 30 to 70% of hepatocyte loss is referred to as submassive necrosis. Then we have massive necrosis where more than 70% of hepatocyte loss occurs, as can be seen in this case. The entire hepatocyte lobules, many lobules are in fact lost. Only a residual small group of hepatocyte is there. Now coming to chronic viral hepatitis, because it is a chronic infection, and I have already told you that the features of chronic viral hepatitis are mainly seen in portal tract in the form of inflammation and in the form of fibrosis. So portal fibrosis begins from the portal tract and it is infiltrated by the inflammatory cells, which are chronic type, like lymphocytes, plasma cells. We'll get to see. In addition to these two findings, we also get to see necrosis and inflammation in the lobules. Then we have, we may or may not have interface hepatitis. I just explained what is interface hepatitis in previous slides. And the bridging necrosis, these two are present in the case of chronic liver disease or chronic viral hepatitis. They indicate progressive liver damage. Now, for chronic viral hepatitis is a form of chronic liver disease. For this, we have to grade the severity of the necrosis and inflammation both in the portal tract and in the lobules, hepatic parenchyma in the lobules. So, necroinflammation grading is done to assess the severity, and staging is done to look for the severity of fibrosis. In initial stages, the fibrosis remains confined to the portal tract, and when it further progresses, it starts developing septa outside the and extends outside the portal tract, forming periportal septal fibrosis. These septa further increases and large, and they form bridging fibrosis, and ultimately with further progression, the entire liver is transformed into a scar tissue, which is called as cirrhosis. Now we will have a look at the portal inflammation and we will try to grade it just to give you an idea. So this is a portal tract where we have chronic inflammatory cell infiltration. If you notice that the circumference of this portal tract is otherwise absolutely smooth and there is only inflammation, that means there is no interface hepatitis, which is also called as piecemeal necrosis. So it is the mildest form. Then as the severity increases, we will get to see an occasional foci of interface hepatitis or piecemeal necrosis, which further progresses to we get to see many foci of interface hepatitis or piecemeal necrosis. Then in case of most severe form, we have this interface hepatitis along the entire circumference of the portal tract. Then we will try to grade the lobular inflammation. And here, this is the mildest form where we can see that the biopsies, otherwise it is maintained architecture and there is no significant inflammation, there is no necrosis except for few intrasinusoidal lymphocytes. So this is the mildest form of lobular inflammation. And when the severity increases, we get many more larger foci of inflammation and associated necrosis. Here in this case, it is focal or spotting necrosis, where small groups of hepatocytes are lost. Now these foci become very frequent in case of severe focal necrosis, where hepatocytes are dead, small groups are dead, and they are surrounded by chronic inflammation. Then we have bridging necrosis, where this necrosis extends from one portal tract to central vein. Then we can do grading for fibrosis where it is severity is assessed. So in case of chronic viral hepatitis, fibrosis begins from the portal tract. So here we have to assess. In this case, there is mild increase in the connective tissue content of the portal tract. So this is mildest form of portal fibrosis. Then this further advances, then what happens? It starts giving out few extensions and in the form of septa in the periportal region. This is also called as periportal fibrosis or periportal septal fibrosis because it begins to give out septa of fibrous tissue in the from the portal tract in periportal area. Then we have another form which is bridging fibrosis, which is the most severe form of fibrosis where these septa further extend and they bridge the gap between two structures. Like it has started from the portal tract, so this fibrous septa may extend to another portal tract or central vein, forming a bridge between two structures. Now, when this process further advances, becomes extensive, it transforms the liver into a nodular configuration, where it is characterized by presence of numerous variably sized degenerative nodules, which are separated by fibrous septa and are completely surrounded by these fibrous tissue. In addition to this, there are proliferating blood vessels, so new vascularization. So cirrhosis is a diffuse process leading to complete transformation of smooth liver into a nodular liver. Here in this case, we can see the nodules which are large in size and other nodules which are very small in size, less than 3, cutoff of less than 3 and more than 3 mm. So this is mixed type of cirrhosis, that is micro and macro nodular cirrhosis. Now we will have a look at the features that are specific to chronic hepatitis C virus. They are very remarkable features. So there are 3 features that we should remember in case of chronic hepatitis C virus. They are very good indicators of identifying the diagnosis. So in case of chronic hepatitis C infection, we may get lymphoid follicles in the portal tract with or without germinal center. So this paler area in the center of lymphoid follicle represents the germinal follicle. So it is a lymphoid follicle. Then another finding is presence of steatosis irrespective of the zone where it involves. So it may be microvesicular steatosis or where there are very small vesicles of fat, or there may be macrovesicular. So it is mixed type of steatosis. So steatosis is also very important. Lymphoid follicle is a very important feature in addition to evidence of ductal damage. As in case of this, we can see a duct which is there and it is infiltrated by lymphoid cells and damaging the ductal epithelium. So there is interruption in the continuity of the lining because of piece formation and damage to the bile duct epithelium. Now we will have a look at features which are specific to chronic hepatitis B virus. These are again very remarkable features. And it is ground glass hepatocytes which are seen in chronic hepatitis B virus infection. And it is characterized by the granular eosinophilic cytoplasm, and it is because of accumulation of hepatitis B surface antigen inside the endoplasmic reticulum of the cells. And this ground glass hepatocyte is regarded as a histologic hallmark for chronic hepatitis B virus. So if we get to see presence of these ground glass hepatocytes in collated biopsy in a patient who is already infected with hepatitis B virus, it is chronic hepatitis B virus infection. Okay. Then another finding is presence of sanded nuclei, and we see it in the form of pale eosinophilic inclusion in the nucleus. So pale eosinophilic intranuclear inclusion. And it is due to accumulation of hepatitis B core antigen in this nuclei. And as I have told you that hepatitis B core antigen is never released in the circulation, but it remains trapped inside the nuclei of the hepatocytes. So these antigens, hepatitis B core antigen, can be detected by using corresponding antibodies. I'll show you the picture. When coming to immunohistochemistry, it is an ancillary technique which is based on detection of particular antigen with specific antibodies, and positive reaction gives a brown color. So in this case, these are ground glass hepatocytes, and the antibody is used against hepatitis B surface antigen. So we can see the positive reaction for hepatitis B surface antigen in ground glass hepatocytes. Similarly, hepatitis B core antigen can be confirmed by using corresponding antibody, and the positive reaction is seen inside the nuclear in the form of brown color. So this is all for today's session, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. It was a very insightful presentation. Now, I would like to put for uh, just a second.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We were very fortunate to gain so much knowledge and experience from you. Thank you for being a part of this event. Before wrapping up, I would like to update about tomorrow's event, that is day 4 of workshop on medical management of hepatitis with guest speaker Dr. A.K. Anuragi. The event will be moderated by Shashwat Singh and Jay Pasi at 7 p.m. Until then, I would like to thank the audience for their patience listening, and Dr. Savita Agarwal and Dr. Ravikant Gupta sir for their precious time and knowledge. I would also like to thank Dr. Rajneesh Raj, President IMA MSN UP, and Dr. Rahul Anand, Secretary IMA MSN UP, and my Statify team. Thank you and stay safe.